In fact, the average writing score is band 5.5. Most of the question types, the answers do come in order.
Part 2, what if they ask you about something that has actually never happened to you and you have no idea what to say?
Most questions are designed so that doesn't happen. An examiner, when they mark your essays, is going to be looking for your position in the introduction and conclusion. What I would do is, first of all, just quickly glance at the questions.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I got an Ielts expert to come and share with us some of the things that you should keep in mind when you're preparing for your Ielts exam. Now, I know that the NMC is currently reviewing the score for nurses, but that's going to take roughly 3 months because they said they are going to take about 2 months to involve the public and get their opinion. And then after that, they're going to take 2 weeks to decide and then inform the public after that. All right, so before then, I know there are people who have actually paid to do their Ielts exams, and even if you wait for the final verdict of the NMC, we don't know exactly what they're going to say about the scores or what changes they would have made. And also, there's nothing wrong with aiming high. There's nothing wrong with wanting to get the highest score. That's why I decided to bring somebody who is an expert, like I mentioned. He used to be an Ielts examiner, so I think this is the right person to tell us what the examiners actually want us to do for us to get a proper score for the Ielts exam. He has a YouTube channel, he has a website where you guys can get access to study materials, you can get access to courses and even quizzes that you can do as part of your preparation for the Ielts exam. So if you want, I'll be leaving links in the description, so make sure to check that out. They are really informative. Anyway, without further ado, let's get straight into the interview. Thank you so much for coming. So if you don't mind, please introduce yourself.
I'd be very happy to. So my name is Eli. I run a website called EnglishProTips.com, and my website, and I also have a YouTube channel, is really aimed at helping students do as well as possible in the Ielts test. So the Ielts test is an exam that people often have to do to migrate to another country or to study in a foreign country. And I've really focused on creating courses that give students the best possible chance of getting their desired score to move abroad.
So today I was hoping that you could share some of the tips that people can keep in mind when they're preparing and doing the Ielts exam. So yeah, maybe we can start with the speaking test, if you're okay with that.
Yes. Yeah, I'd be very happy to. So we did a speaking test last week, and It was a phenomenal speaking test. I think it was maybe one of the highest level speaking tests I've ever done in my life and in my career as an Ielts expert. So I definitely suggest that people watch that video, and unconsciously they're going to be picking up on a lot of the tips and a lot of the strategies that you used in the test, because you got a kind of perfect score in Ielts. But just to kind of break it down, I'll see if I can come up with some specific tips to help your viewers. So many people will know there's 3 parts to the speaking test. There's part 1, which is around 4 to 5 minutes, and that's asking questions, or the examiner asks you kind of personal questions about your life. And in this part, I recommend that you try to relax into the test. Don't give very short answers. So one thing that sometimes happens with people with a good level of English is they don't show off that language and they don't fully represent their level of English. So don't give short answers, but also don't give artificially long answers. What I think is, if you find yourself resonating with a topic or you've got more to say, then go with that. So I remember in our speaking test, when I was asking you about your work, and I was asking you what would improve your work, it was very natural. You were saying, oh, well, the salary is not the best, and I wish the nurse-patient ratio was different. And I got the sense that it was a real answer, and you were communicating your real ideas to me. And you did that so well, and that even at the very beginning, I knew that you were going to be getting a very high score.
Wow.
So that's part 1, and I think really kind of relax into it. And the purpose of part 1 is to ideally try and make you relaxed, and that's why you get asked a lot of personal questions about your experience. Now, part two, which is the part that most people get a bit scared about, is when you have to talk for 2 minutes. The examiner will say 1 to 2 minutes, but really you should be speaking for 2 minutes. And you're going to be given a card or a topic, something like where would you like to go on holiday, or describe a time when you ate a wonderful cake. You know, it could be anything really. And I would definitely recommend that you aim to tell a story about your life, because when you tell a story, it's much easier to come up with details about that story and to have a logical progression in your speech. And for many people, they've never actually spoken English alone for 2 minutes before. So I highly recommend, before you go to do your IELTS test, find some part 2 cue cards and record yourself on your mobile phone and get used to speaking for 2 minutes, because actually it's quite a long time. And you also need to be able to speak for 2 minutes without looking at the clock. So the examiner actually tells you when to stop. And so actually that would be another piece of advice. Don't say, is it time? Or, okay, that's the end. Because you need to show the examiner that you can speak eloquently for 2 minutes. So just speak, and then eventually the examiner will say, all right, time to stop. And you'll move on. And then you've got part 3. And in part 3, you're asked more questions related to the same theme as part 2. And what I would recommend is try to elaborate on your ideas and your thoughts, and not so much on your personal experiences. So, for example, if you're asked about where people like to travel to in your country, don't talk about where you like to travel to, but try to talk more broadly about people in your country. And also think about exceptions. So you say, well, if people have high enough incomes, then they often go abroad. However, nowadays people don't have disposable income to travel, and there are lots of domestic options for travel as well. So don't focus on yourself, but focus on your ideas in part 3.
Or part 2, what if they ask you about something that has actually never happened to you and you have no idea what to say? Do you recommend just maybe saying something you saw in a movie and trying to expound on that, or what do you think?
Yeah, so most questions are designed so that doesn't happen. But it certainly does happen. Like, for example, most questions would be something like a time you've seen a painting, or a book that you've read that you enjoy. And the idea is that hopefully everyone's seen a painting and hopefully everyone's enjoyed a book. However, it does sometimes happen that you look at the topic and your mind goes blank. So I remember it once happened to a student of mine. In part 2, they were asked a time they arrived late for something, and they just couldn't think of an example. And of course, I'm sure in their life they have arrived late for something in their life, but you know, in that moment, within their 1 minute of preparation, they couldn't really think of an example. And in that case, you can just lie. You can just kind of make up a story. And unfortunately, when you do find yourself lying and making up a story, it tends to be more difficult to speak for 2 minutes. So ideally, that's not the case. But at the end of the day, the examiner's never really going to check. So feel free just to lie or tell a story about, something you've seen in a film or something one of your friends has told you before, and just make it your own. So I've actually recently made a video on 9 tips for the listening test. And that's on YouTube. And what I'll try and do is summarize those 9 tips as quickly as possible. One of the main things about the listening test is it's a test of concentration skills, as well as your ability to understand English. And that's because you only get to listen once, which I think is very cruel.
It is.
It's very cruel. And so what happens sometimes is it's the first test that you do that day. You tend to do listening, then reading, then writing. And people aren't really prepared when they go in. And so what happens is their mind's not fully in an exam state, and they might miss the first question. And as a result, it's really hard to recover from that, because they get flustered, then they get flustered. And because they're flustered, they miss the next question, they get more flustered. So number 1 would be to practice your concentration skills. It's a really good idea to have done a lot of practice tests before and to really go in ready to sit the test. And as a result, I think when you're on your way to the test, listen to something in English or have an English conversation and just activate your brain, because it could be quite early in the morning, or have a coffee or try some meditation. The idea is you want your brain to be able to concentrate for that long period of time. So that was number one. Number two would be to read and underline the questions during any moment that you can, really. So in the listening test, they'll be reading out some instructions. And you don't really need to listen to those instructions, ideally, because you've already done the practice tests. So just spend that time quickly reading through the questions over and over again, and just underlining words that are going to help you quickly refer back to those questions. When it does come to the instructions, it's very important that you pay attention to the written instructions in the questions. So often they'll say something like, write no more than 2 words and or a number. And so if you write 3 words, you're automatically going to lose marks. So you need to be aware of those instructions. Also, spelling is important. I often see students that lose marks because they spell words incorrectly. So if you know that you struggle with spelling, make an effort to improve your spelling before the listening test. And often in the exam, they'll choose words that are typically quite difficult to spell in English, words like library or maybe environment. So it's a lot of students get that N in the middle. And online you can find lists of common words that appear in the listening test, and basically just have a look through those and see if you can improve your spelling. In my listening video, I've got a PDF of some typical words that are misspelled in the listening test. Get familiar with the different accents.
Yes, that's a good one.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, if I ask you, Nancy, are there particular accents that you find easier to understand or more difficult to understand?
The Australian accent was one of the biggest issues I had, because I felt like I could understand the British and the American. Canadian is kind of similar to the American. The Australian one was like the biggest problem. So I tried to find like Australian movies or like clips on YouTube just to try and familiarize myself with that. But luckily, I don't think I got that in the exam. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Right. Well, that's good. But it's wonderful that you proactively tried to improve your ability to understand those Australian accents. I actually find that one of the best ways is actually by doing lots of practice tests. You become familiar with all the accents that appear in the test. And sometimes they even use the same actors. So you'll be like, oh, wait, there's that guy that I heard in Cambridge Book 13, Test 4. And you're already kind of familiar with that person's voice.
Yeah, practice helps, because I remember, I think listening was one of the things I practiced more, because at night I would just be there like at midnight just doing the listening test. So practice, it does help.
Yeah, so and I would say that's my main tip actually for listening, is to practice a lot. And what I like to do is divide the practice into 3 stages. So the first stage is when you've got a long time before your test. Give yourself a lot of time in this preparation, and just do one section at a time and all the questions, and then read the tape script and listen again, and then just find out which questions you got wrong and why you got these questions wrong, and maybe write down new words. And just even if you don't do the whole test in one day, if you aim to do one part of that test very well, you're improving your listening skills. And that's going to help you later on. And then in the second stage, so maybe a month before your test or 2 months before your test, you do the entire listening test. And again, with tape script and learning from it, writing down new words. And then in the third stage, so maybe when you've got less than 1 month before your test, try and do the listening, the reading and the writing test at the same in the same day, just to get used to that stamina required to do well in the test.
Those are really amazing tips. Yeah. I wish I had this when I was doing my exam.
Yeah. And when you did your exam, which part were you most nervous about?
Oh, the writing test. I don't know why, because in school we wrote like so many essays. We used to call them compositions. Like in every exam there was always an essay, but somehow I was having a very difficult time with the writing part.
Yeah.
And I think for most people, the writing part is usually the problem.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Certainly, anyone that needs to get band 7 in all parts
Yeah.
of the test, what they typically find most difficult is to get the band 7 in writing. And in fact, the
Yeah.
average writing score is band 5.5. And
Really?
it's 6.5 in listening and reading. So it's a whole band score lower for writing. And that's
Wow.
particularly the case in certain countries as well. For example, in
Yeah.
China, there's a lower average writing score, a much lower writing score than listening and reading in particular.
Why do you think writing is a problem for most people? I really don't understand it, because some of us we think we write really well, but when it comes to the IELTS exam itself, we don't do so well.
Yeah, I think there's certain conventions that students struggle with that are maybe particular to IELTS. So, for example, an examiner, when they mark your essays, is going to be looking for your position in the introduction and conclusion. And for example, many students don't write their introduction, their position, their opinion in the introduction, because they've taught that you only do that in the conclusion. But in the IELTS exam, you do it in the introduction and conclusion if you want to get band 7+. And other things like in China, for example, it's very common for students to write their hopes and dreams about the future in the conclusion. And actually, that's not something that the IELTS test requires and could be considered irrelevant and actually lower your score. So even though you've got these conventions of what a good essay is in your country, it's maybe not what the IELTS exam is looking for. And I think that's one reason why the writing test is harder. And then the other reason is I think it's very noticeable when someone makes a mistake in writing. In speaking, it's not so noticeable because you're also communicating with your gestures and the way that you look and the pitch of your voice. So as a result, mistakes aren't picked up as easily. But when an examiner is reading your essay, they don't have any of this extra information. They're just looking at the words that you're using and the structures that you're using. And so the mistakes really jump out a lot more.
Do you lose marks because of your handwriting, if your handwriting is not very legible?
No, you wouldn't. But if your handwriting is awful, then it can cause a lot of difficulty for the examiner. So what would happen typically is if an examiner is struggling to read your handwriting, they'll try and bring in other examiners and they'll work on it to try and work out exactly what this person is saying. One tricky thing is, unconsciously, they're creating a bit of a bias against you, though, if they're having to really understand it. And they might be somewhat unfairly imagining that this reflects on your organization skills or your ability to convey your ideas and your coherence and your cohesion. So I would recommend trying to write as legibly as possible. And also, if you know you've got bad handwriting, you can do the computer-based IELTS, which is also a good option for people who type a lot faster than they write.
And also, when there are many people, it's easier for them to pick out the mistakes that the other person didn't see. So you lose more marks.
That's also true. Yeah, that's also a very good point. Although sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes when examiners collaborate on a particularly difficult piece of writing, one of them will say, "Oh, actually, look, they've used the passive here really well." And they go, "Oh yeah, it's true, they've used the passive really well." So that shows that they can use complex structures. And so it can go both ways. When examiners collaborate on an essay, sometimes it can go up, sometimes it can go down.
And now, since we are speaking about the writing, do you have any tips for the writing part?
Yes. So there's the academic and the general test, and basically in those tests, task 1 is different. In the general, they write a letter, and in the academic, they write a report. So what I'll do is I'll focus on task 2, which is the essay, just so that people doing the academic and general test can understand. So there's basically 5 different types of essay question you can be asked. The most common by far, usually around like more than 20% of the time, it's an agree-disagree question. So a question that has like an introduction and then I'll say, to what extent do you agree or disagree? So I would recommend that you spend a lot of time practicing these types of questions because they're the most common. So you've got the agree-disagree questions, you've got advantage-disadvantage questions, discussion questions, double questions, and direct questions. And by far the most common is the agree-disagree questions. However, you could get any of these different question types. What I would recommend is learn which structure you're going to use for each of these question types. So as soon as you see an advantage, disadvantage question, you go, oh, that's an advantage, disadvantage question. I'm going to use this structure. Or, oh, that's a double question. I'm going to use this structure. And in that way, you'll feel more confident. You'll be able to write a lot more quickly. And you'll also know when you've written over 250 words as well.
Now we can talk about the reading tests.
Yeah.
Because I know for me, this was a problem because the essays they were bringing to me, they were so boring. And every time I tried to read the whole, oh my God, I used to just, kind of fall asleep. So just give us some tips on how to cope with that as well.
Yes. Well, first of all, don't fall asleep. If you fall asleep, that'd be an absolute disaster. So I think, the falling asleep is a real issue because you're right. They're not very engaging texts. And when they're not engaging, you often lose concentration. And you go from a kind of actively engaging with the text to kind of passively hoping that it finishes. And so one thing is, if you're quite deliberate in your approach to IELTS reading, then you stay within a kind of active mindset and you pay more attention. So I would, first of all, structure my approach to each of the sections of the text. So what I would do is, first of all, just quickly glance at the questions, acknowledge what kind of question types they are. And then I would skim read the text. And as I'm skim reading, I'll just, I'll have a pencil, or if I'm doing it on the computer, I'll highlight the names, I'll highlight theories, I'll highlight dates. And in the margin, or just in my mind, I'll think about what's in each paragraph. So that way I'm engaging with the text, I'm making it more active, and I'm getting an idea of the rough layout of the text. And then once I've done that, I'll go on to tackling the questions. And I'll, again, try and engage with the questions. So I'll be underlining words that help me to understand the question. And then I'll be looking at the text in detail and getting the answer across. Also, for most of the question types, the answers do come in order. So if there's a question that I don't know, I'll actually skip that and I'll do the one afterwards. And then if I get the answer for the question afterwards, I'll know roughly where the answer is for the previous question. And then if I can't find that, I'll often skip it completely. But until the end, just to make sure that I can finish the exam in time, because you don't really have that long. It's often a race against time in the reading test. For people that know that they struggle with the time element of the reading test, I would also suggest that maybe leave the multiple choice questions till the very end, because they've actually got a higher chance of guessing them correctly. So if there's only 3 options or 4 options, then they've got a 33% chance or 25% chance of getting them right. Whereas if you have to write a word from the text, you've got less than 1% chance that you choose the right word. So if you know you struggle with the time, then leave those multiple choice questions until the end. Also, be careful about spelling mistakes. Lots of students lose marks because of spelling mistakes. So if you're doing the computer-based test, you can just copy and paste the text across. And then the 2 last tips. One of them, again, is to practice a lot. And again, I would recommend that 3-stage approach, where early on in your preparation, you give yourself a lot of time. You don't time yourself. You look at the answers, you try and figure out why you got them right or why you got them wrong, and you record the new words. In the 2nd stage, you time yourself doing a whole test. And then in the 3rd stage, you time yourself doing all of the tests together. And so you're just building that stamina. And the last thing is to read extensively. So read a lot of novels, articles, and just read as much as you can, because it's a skill that's definitely transferable to an exam. And I believe that's what you did, right, Nancy?
Yeah, for me, that's what I did. And, as much as I was finding them boring, like you said, I just looked through the questions first. And then now I went back to the essay, because I felt like I didn't actually have to fully understand what they were saying. All I had to do was get the right answers.
Yes, that's a very good point. Some people get a bit flustered because they think they have to understand the whole text, but all they have to do is answer the question.
Yeah. I have another question. Like for me, when I got my writing results, I had a 6.5 and they wanted me to get 7. So some people were advising me to, apply for a remarking. Do you advise that? Do you advise on that? Because I know you used to be an IELTS examiner.
Right.
Is that a good?
Yeah, so that's called EOR, inquiry on results, and it's typically with the speaking or the writing test is when you can do that, because if you get a lower score in the reading test or listening test, that's probably your true score, and you're not going to get a higher score. But certainly, sometimes your score does go up, and sometimes it doesn't go up, and you lose the money, unfortunately. And what I've tried to do is come up with some questions to help you decide whether it's worth it. And so I've got that on my website. And it's questions like, for the writing, did you write your position in the introduction and conclusion? And you say, okay, yes, I did. Okay, great. And then the next question might be, did you have examples to develop your ideas? And they say, yes, I did. And I go, okay, great. And by answering these questions, if the answer to all of them is yes, then maybe your writing does deserve band 7. And if you get band 6.5, maybe it's just been unfairly lowered. So in that case, I would suggest that you do consider going for the EOR, the inquiry on results. Did you ever have to do an EOR, and was it successful? Or do you know people that were successful or weren't successful?
Honestly, I don't know anyone who was, because for me, I decided not to, because after I got my results and I realized I had failed, when I went to do the exam the first time, I just showed up for the exam. I didn't study. I was just thinking, it's an English exam. I've been speaking English all my life, so it's an easy test, So I didn't even know the structure of how I was going to do my writing. So when I checked the study websites and all of that, I realized, oh my God, even if I submit, for a remarking, I don't think they'll give me the 0.5. Yeah. So I decided to do the exam again. Now, at least understanding what the examiner wanted from me.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why sometimes it's quite useful if you've had your essays that you've written during your preparation period, if you've had them evaluated by an ex-examiner or by a teacher with a lot of experience of IELTS.
Yeah.
Because then for example, I always get 7.5, and it's very strange that I get 6.5 in the Rio exam. That kind of thing.
Thank you so much, Eli. I've actually learned so much. I wish you existed when I was doing the exam, because I would have done it only once. But thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure my viewers will appreciate it. And I know people will want to come and visit your YouTube channel and your website as well. So I'm going to leave links down below. Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you. It's always a pleasure to chat to you, Nancy. And it's wonderful. I hope I haven't bombarded or given people too many things to think about. I realized I was speaking very quickly and lots of different ideas, but if there was any part that wasn't clear, people were also welcome to send me an email at eli@englishprotips.com, and I'll do my best to answer questions and to clarify any points that I made in this video.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.